So good morning. My name is Warren Lindsay. I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Chicago Leadership Forum. And so on behalf of the Chicago Leadership Forum and Relevant Radio, who we're grateful to have as a co-sponsor for today's event, I'd like to thank you all this morning for joining us. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to say just a few brief words about our organization. The Chicago Leadership Forum was created with the purpose of providing Christian professionals a forum for the exchange of ideas on topics of critical importance to our culture. Our speakers, like our guests this morning, are internationally renowned for their contributions to their fields. And they offer truly unique insights into the application of Christian principles as professionals, family members, and citizens. Now, our ability to offer this top quality programming is, however, entirely dependent on the generosity of supporters like you. And so if you enjoy our events, we ask that you please do spread the word and consider making a donation at www.chicagoleadershipforum.org. And as always, please keep our mission in your prayers. And now to today's event. Here to speak with us about what really happened at the Synod in Rome is Dr. Robert Royal, who is the founder and president of the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C., and editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing. His books include 1492 and All That, Political Manipulations of History, The Virgin and the Dynamo, The Use and Abuse of Religion in the Environment Debate, The Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century, A Comprehensive Global History, and many more. Dr. Royal holds a BA and MA from Brown University and a PhD in Comparative Literature from the Catholic University of America. He has taught at Brown University, Rhode Island College, and the Catholic University of America. He received fellowships to study in Italy from the Renaissance Society of America in 1977 and as a Fulbright Scholar in 1978. Won't you all please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Robert Royal.
Well, thank you all for coming out this early in the morning on a cold Chicago day. I was going to make a joke about how cold it is, except my wife tells me that it's only 2 degrees warmer in Washington, D.C. today, which is supposedly a southern city, unlike Chicago. Our subject is the recent extraordinary synod in Rome. And I'm tempted in one way to say, forget everything you've heard about it because it's not what you think, but in a way it is. We got you here a little bit under false pretenses because to know what really happened at the Synod, I think, is only in the hands of God. Even I think Pope Francis doesn't entirely know what transpired there, but we can kind of discern some of the things that actually happened. And one of the reasons I went to Rome, I don't usually cover stories like this like a newspaper reporter, but one of the reasons I went is that I knew that because the subject was about the family and marriage in the context of evangelization, that inevitably it would lead to all sorts of controversies, confusions, hopes, misconceptions, etc. And that's, in fact, what exactly happened during the course of the Synod. So I'm going to just very briefly try to go through some of that and explain to you what I think on the basis of what I personally saw when I was there, and on the basis of the people who I most trust, who are permanent reporters and Vaticanologists in Rome, and just to try to get a sense of where things came out at the very end and what we might think is going to happen in the future. Because this was an extraordinary synod. This was not yet the full synod on family, marriage, and evangelization. That is going to take place next October. In quite an unusual move, the Holy Father decided that there would be a first sort of preparatory, extraordinary synod to identify some themes that would be talked about in the ordinary synod. Now, all of this, in case you don't know what a synod is, a synod just means the coming together, basically, of bishops to consult with one another. The Catholic Church is not a a democracy, so it's not like they come together and they vote on things and then the Holy Father is bound by that. He is ultimately the person who has to make decisions about the governance and doctrinal matters inside the Catholic Church. But they're there to kind of advise him. And this began, this modern series of synods began in 1965 after Vatican II, when Paul VI wanted to, in line with the documents of Vatican II, get more input from the world's bishops. And modern jet travel made it possible for people to get over to Rome easily and back out. I mean, I myself occasionally will go to Rome for 2 or 3 days, give a lecture, and come back. It's relatively easy now for bishops to do that from almost all parts of the world. So the ordinary synod will meet next October. This extraordinary synod began the reflections on what some of the themes would be for next year, and it's in the course of this extraordinary synod, and even a little bit before, as I'll explain, that a number of kind of controversial issues came to the fore. And you know what they are. They're gay marriage, people with same-sex attraction. Another big issue, of course, was whether communion can be distributed to people who are divorced and remarried and not annulled. This would be a change in, people say, pastoral practice, but not doctrine, because going right back to Jesus himself, the Church has always believed in the indissolubility of marriage, that marriage cannot, a properly constituted marriage cannot be dissolved. It's forever. You know, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. That's Jesus' own words. And I want to make clear at the beginning, because I'm going to talk as if this was a political event to a certain extent, and it's not, or at least it's not entirely. You can study the Catholic Church, or you can study an event that takes place under church auspices as if it were, you know, a political discussion where there are liberals and conservatives and progressives and traditionalists and whatnot. And certainly that could be applied to certain elements in this synod as much as to other events. But ultimately, what the Church is in business for is to follow Jesus Christ. When Pope Francis was elected in March of 2013, I covered that conclave with EWTN, the Catholic Television Network, and he asked all of us who were journalists to come over to a meeting he had. He was elected on Thursday. On a Saturday morning, he had a big meeting in the Aula Palisesto, it's called, this big audience hall that holds about 12,000 people, or can hold 12,000 people. And there were 6,000 journalists in the room. And he comes in and he says, "Oh, I want to thank you all so much, because because of the way you covered this election, you understood that the Catholic Church is not simply a political outfit, it also has a spiritual dimension." Well, I looked around the room, and I think there were maybe 3 people who actually had covered it that way. And I said, boy, this is a very shrewd Pope, because he's praising people for something they didn't really do, but maybe the next time, you know, they'll remember, oh yeah, that's right, there is a spiritual dimension to this Catholic Church. So I want to make that clear. I'm going to talk about some of the currents, but keep in the back of your minds that ultimately all these reflections are intended to get us closer and closer to what God wants human beings to do. And I noticed that Archbishop Supich yesterday in his homily talked about this tendency to say, well, I've done enough. When in fact, you know, you need to get outside your comfort zone and go farther, and always keep going farther. And that's certainly a very good spiritual principle to follow. So, what was the extraordinary synod about? Now, you saw the controversies, and I want to sort out a little bit how those came to be. But in the final document, which is called a relatio, a relation of what happened at the synod, which was, the official document is published in Italian, and then there was an English translation made. It took a couple of weeks, actually, for this translation to come out. Here's what the Synod Fathers voted on and approved, and I think this is, it's in paragraph 4, so it comes very early in the document. Here's what they said was the sort of core of what they were trying to do. Facing the situation with an eye on the Lord Jesus to discern how the church and society can renew their commitment to the family. Now, that's very straightforward. We all understand the importance of that because in a Catholic understanding, it's not individual persons who are the basis of society, as we often think here in the United States. It's the family. Because persons don't exist independent of other persons. So it's a philosophical point, but it's also a very practical thing. We just know that babies who aren't, don't interact with parents don't develop verbal skills, they don't develop self-control. I mean, we all are shaped initially in our families, and then those virtues and those gifts that we develop in our families, they spread out into the society as a whole. So the family is a very important concept, not solely within religious circles, but also in the most fundamental social and political sense as well. Well, I just read you that about how the church, to discern how the church and society can renew their commitment to the family in the English translation. However, on top of all the other controversies and I think misperceptions that existed, this translation did not really reflect the text. What the text actually said is this, and I'm going to reread it. Facing the situation with an eye on the Lord Jesus to discern how the church and society can renew their commitment to the family, that's where I just stopped, founded on the marriage between man and woman, the Italian went on, a phrase that mysteriously disappeared in the English translation that took 2 weeks to produce. Now, in a different context, you might say, I've translated 2 large books about St. Thomas Aquinas, about 600 pages each, and I can tell you, when you do a long text like that, there are a couple dozen places where you make mistakes and somebody comes behind you and clears things up. The fact that that phrase about marriage being founded on man and woman, a man and a woman, disappeared, of course, sets off alarm bells among people who are worried that there seems to be something going on within the church itself that's weakening this commitment to monogamous marriage as it's been entirely understood for the history of the West since Christianity came into prominence in our culture. Now, how that happened, I don't know. And this is one of the ways that when we talked about what really happened at the Synod, we're getting you here somewhat under false pretenses because I don't know how that could happen. I don't know how a translator can fail to notice that phrase, number one. And number two, I don't know how someone in authority, presumably somebody in the press office or somebody in a doctrinal office had to sit there with the 2 texts side by side, right? I mean, you don't, anybody in a business wouldn't let a contract go out without comparing and making sure that everything is lined up. And on this very, very sensitive issue about marriage between a man and a woman, the fact that that was either missed by the translators and then either allowed or not caught by someone in authority, I think is very troubling. Because at the very least, it shows a certain level of bumbling incompetence on a key issue that the church cares about, right? I mean, this isn't just some obscure theological point. This goes to some very fundamental things in Catholic doctrine as well as in social practice. So what that means, I'm not clear about, but it's worth knowing that too, 2 weeks after the Synod had published its final report, that too now is up in the air. How did that possibly happen? The priest who noticed this, Father Robert Imbelli, teaches at Boston College. I'm actually in contact with him now about this sort of thing. And he discovered that. He couldn't believe it. He was just kind of shocked that such a phrase could disappear from a text. And I haven't checked recently, but for a while the English translation was taken down from the Vatican website. So it may have been reconfigured and maybe put back up. You can check on the Vatican. It's just www.vatican.va, and you can read it for yourself. Now, one of the curious things about the Synod is it was bookended by 2 things that I think help orient us in a different way than the media have tended to talk about the Synod. Because, the secular media don't understand Catholicism. They don't understand the Synod process. What they understand is politics in the bad sense that I talked about at the beginning. So what are they going to write about? They aren't going to write about the fact that the church reaffirmed the family and thinks the family is an important part of society, or that Jesus Christ talked about the indissolubility of marriage. They're going to fasten on those hot button issues: divorce, remarriage, and communion without annulment, and people with same-sex attraction. That the church is allegedly reaching out to those people, which it is. Under Francis, there's this kind of evangelical energy that he brings, and he's a genius at this, of trying to reach out to everyone possible and try to bring people closer into the church. However, here's what the Instrumentum Laboris, this is sort of the work plan. The Pope appoints a committee. Usually he doesn't get involved in drafting the work plan for the Extraordinary Synod, but he was involved very much in this. We know this for certainty. And they produced a document, not a particularly long document, and for a document written by a committee, a pretty good one. It's not terrible. It's not, it's not William Faulkner, but it's kind of it's an interesting document. It deals with marriage problems and family problems all over the world. Africa's got polygamy problems, and there are all sorts of different situations. Toward the end of that document, in a sort of summary passage, there's a quotation from Paul VI's Humane Vitae, which everybody talks about as the contraception encyclical of Paul VI that came out in 1968 and was very controversial because it reaffirmed the church's teaching against artificial contraception. So for that to be there and sort of near the conclusion was itself a sign of something, it seems to me. And then at the other end of the synod, on the Sunday following the close of the synod, Pope Paul VI was beatified by Pope Francis. Last step before he becomes Saint Paul VI. So there are these indications that run counter to the usual media meme about Pope Francis, that he's kind of weakening the church's commitment, and he's accepting of gays. Who am I to judge that? That too, a very large misunderstanding. And let me just read to you the passage that is quoted from Humane Vitae in that Instrumentum Laboris, as it's called, the work plan for the Synod. It is to be anticipated that perhaps not everyone will easily accept this particular teaching. An intensive, clamorous outcry is being raised against the voice of the Church, which is made more intense by today's means of communication. But it comes as no surprise to the Church that she, no less than her divine founder, is destined to be a sign of contradiction. She does not, because of this, evade the duty imposed on her of proclaiming humbly but firmly the entire moral law, both natural and evangelical. Now, that's a powerful statement to have quoted from a pope who is regarded by some in the Church as controversial and maybe retrograde and not, with the program. And then also then to affirm Paul VI at the end. So I mention this because, as you all know, Pope Francis is a hard guy to figure out. Even your cardinal, your former cardinal, who's one of the brainiest men I've ever worked with, said in an interview just in the past few days, I'd like to get together with him and ask him if he understands the confusion that some of his remarks induce in the Church and in the world. And second, I'd like to ask him, what exactly do you mean? Because it is kind of hard to figure the guy out. He's kind of speaks, off the cuff, and he's got that energy, that kind of evangelical energy, but he will tend to say things that can be confusing or misconstrued. And of course, the media love to misconstrue and to give the Catholic Church advice about what it ought to do, even though they just scorn the Catholic Church, right? There was a lot of nastiness, I can tell you. Talked about the Pope over in Rome. People talked about him as Juan Perón, the Latin dictator. People were even saying, he's not well, he won't last all that long. This is, I think, reflective of the kind of nervousness that people feel because of the lack of clarity. But at the same time, I think there were some of these positive elements that I mentioned, like the quotations from Paul VI, and certainly some of the cardinals. I'm sure all of you know Cardinal Burke, who's from Wisconsin here, who's a very, I wouldn't even call him outspoken. I think he's just a kind of a down-to-earth Midwesterner who's very faithful to the Church's understanding of things. He came forward and was very forceful in making some statements about divorce, remarriage, and communion. And then Cardinal Pell from Australia, who I think Joe Starshik played rugby against when they were both at Oxford some years ago. We were talking about this the other day. He's an old footballer. I mean, he's a kind of tough guy, you know. Joe's a tough guy, too. He stood up. There was a conference that the Boston Globe, which has a New Catholic page called Crux. There was a conference Wednesday night, the first week of the Synod. He stood up and he said this. This is very interesting. He said that he was going to say something that was ecclesiastically incorrect. And he said that I might be tempted to hope that Christ had been a little bit softer on divorce, but he wasn't, and I stick with him. Yeah, that's the voice, right? I mean, that's the voice that has to come through. Now, the question is, you know, the question keeps getting asked over and over again, and let me start with that question about the question of divorce and remarriage. The Pope, I think, backed into a controversy by inviting Cardinal Casper back in February to give the keynote address to a group of bishops who met in a preliminary way. And Casper has for years talked about how the Catholic Church ought to use an option that the Orthodox have, where, yeah, they know that somebody was married, the marriage breaks up, somebody gets remarried, and they have what they call economia. So what they say is, well, you know, that was a marriage, it's indissoluble, it wasn't, it's still, the two people are still married, but as a matter of discipline, we let somebody go through a period of penitence, and then they can be readmitted to communion. And even Casper said the number of people who are going to want to do this is going to be relatively small, although, you know, here in the United States, maybe that's not quite the case. The problem with this, of course, is a simple logical one. If you're still married to your former wife, and you're in a sexual relationship with somebody you're not married to, it's a little bit hard to see how you can go to communion in those circumstances. And a lot of people have pointed that out. It doesn't seem possible to put these two things together in the Catholic understanding of what it means to receive communion, which is to be in perfect communion with God himself through the church and receiving. That's what communion means, to be part of that intimate body of Christ that is united with Jesus and with God. So that controversy boils on, and as committees tend to do, I say this after having lived in Washington for 30 years, the bishops decided to kick the can down the road. What they said in the final document was, this needs theological study. So the theological study will go on over the next year, and I think a lot of that study is also going to be accompanied, I'm sorry to say, by a political campaign, because Cardinal Casper and others are already out, you know, giving lectures all over the place, and it's kind of ugly to see this in the church, but I think we saw it after Vatican II, and that's what's going to happen between now and next October. So I'm going to have to go to Rome again next October, and you can read in the Catholic thing about my daily woes. A young woman who I've known for years as a student of Father Schall's, the great Father Schall at Georgetown, told me at a dinner last week that when she was reading my daily reports about the Extraordinary Synod, that it was very odd because she said, I found it at the same time terrifying and also reassuring somehow. I don't know what that means. But I'll try to tell some more of the truth about what I saw on a daily basis. Perhaps the crucial point that induced confusion about what was happening at the Extraordinary Synod had to do with gay relationships. Okay, because during the first week, there was, you know, we knew that there was this controversy over divorce and remarriage. And we knew that there were different factions within the Synod, people who were more progressive, people who were more conservative. There were also 24 lay people. There were couples who were invited. And I think that the lay couples were the most interesting speakers. I mean, they would come out during the press briefings, and they would talk about the things that they actually do to help people keep their marriages together. We were talking about Retrouvailles and some of these other groups who really try to get people to understand what marriage is, because most people don't. You know, during the course of the Synod, it was even talked about changing formation programs as people are getting married, because it's the case in the modern world that it's almost like having a vocation to the priesthood or to the religious life, that you're going to be in a world where marriage is understood in a very different way, And the pressures on the marriage, and you know, these include economic pressures and social pressures and cultural and sexual pressures, they're enormous. And people really need to have a better formation than they've ever had in the past. I think that some of the nervousness that arose over what you could call the outreach to people with same-sex attraction has to do with that sense that there might be a weakening of the very clear and firm Catholic understanding about marriage, but there was more, too. The first day that I was actually in the press briefing was Monday, I want to say the 13th of October. And as I walked into that Vatican press office, they hadn't yet come out and presented what's called the Relatio Post Dissertationem. You don't need to know about that, it won't be on the exam. It means sort of the midterm report. There are 2 weeks, and in the middle of the synod, the bishops and the others, the lay people, present a document publicly about what they've talked about so that they can, in the second week, you know, refine, go into some further things that they may want to present to the Holy Father. And he did not say a word. He sat through every session, but did not say a word during the synod. Now, here's where the big problem started. The document that came out was, I think, 55, I got it here, it's about 55 paragraphs long, and most of them were, you know, the boilerplate you would expect to come out of a Catholic document. The difficulty came in 3 paragraphs, numbers 50 through 52, that deal with same-sex attraction. And I'm going to read just paragraph 50 to you, because we don't want to go too long this morning. Homosexuals have gifts and qualities to offer to the Christian community. Are we capable of welcoming these people, guaranteeing to them a fraternal space in our communities? Often they wish to encounter a church that offers them a welcoming home. Are our communities capable of providing that, accepting and valuing their sexual orientation without compromising Catholic doctrine on the family and matrimony? Now, that went off like a bomb in Rome. I've been to Rome 100 times. I have never seen anything like this. For that entire day, people who had, you know, been studying the Vatican for 20 or 30 years were walking around just sort of in a daze that the Catholic Church could say such a thing, even though at the very end you notice this is without compromising Catholic doctrine. Well, you know, how do you, again, there's a kind of a logical contradiction. If the doctrine and the discipline is marriages between one man and one woman, how do you value this? And as Michael Voris, who's a bit of a controversial figure, I know, I met him for the first time over in Rome, he put the question to Archbishop Bruno Forte, who, Cardinal Erdo from Hungary was the guy who actually presided over the whole synod, and he was quite happy when a question came up about this passage to point to Archbishop Bruno Forte and say, well, Forte wrote this passage, I'll let him handle it. You know, cardinals do this sort of thing too. And Michael Voris said to him, well, you know, look, you know, everybody agrees that homosexuals are people, and they've been created by God, and they have gifts, and we value them as human beings. They have dignity. We shouldn't discriminate against them for that. But you seem to be suggesting here that there is something that comes out of homosexuality itself that is a gift to the church. Is that what you're saying? And in what may be the most abstract political punt I have ever seen in my life, Archbishop Forte says, well, that's an ontological question, and it's hard to answer ontological questions. So he didn't really want to touch it either. Now, there are 2 other paragraphs like that, and there's just this talk about, you know, when a couple takes care, you know, they care for one another, there's real charity there, and what does the church do? But in addition to this amazing passage that people were saying they'd never seen appear in a church document, the bishops themselves, who were participants in the synod, did not see this document before it appeared. And many of them, I'm sure if you followed this in the press, were utterly astounded that there were these passages in this midterm report, which was supposed to set up the program for the second week. And this is where the controversy really got swirling, because People started to say the process was being manipulated. You know, the Vatican spokesman, Father Lombardi, had to come out and say, well, you know, wait a minute. The very next day, in a 180-degree turnaround, that was Monday, this came out. The very next day, a different slate of cardinals came out, and more or less they said, never mind, that was a mistake. You know, we hadn't seen that. That's not what we really talked about. This doesn't accurately reflect what the first week of our synod was about. And the most interesting man of all was Cardinal Wilfred Fox Napier, who's a black African from South Africa, who in a very elegant presentation said, a message went out yesterday, this document, a message went out yesterday, which was not the right message. That was not what the bishops were talking about in the room. And he said, as so often happens with the church, we got a media fumble here, and now we're laboring to catch up. And he said, this is his term, he said, the situation may well be irredeemable. Irredeemable is his actual term. So at that point, there was confusion inside and outside. You know, from one day to the next, there had been this 180-degree turn. Press was carrying, you know, conservatives are trying to block it. The bishops had not really talked about those things, and it was impossible. And this is why I can't tell you definitively what really happened at the synod. The Pope had decided to keep the proceedings closed. Usually what happens at a synod is on a day-by-day basis, there's a very brief summary of what each person says. So, you know, 5 or 6 people make speeches, which are called interventions, and there's a, you know, 1 or 2 line summary, so you can kind of follow along, you know, what were they talking about. Pope decided that, as he said, he wanted people to speak to him frankly, and he thought that if the discussions were off the record, people would feel freer to actually speak. Now, that may be true, but it meant that people on the outside couldn't really tell what was true and not true about what was going on internally. And, you know, you can, let's say for the sake of argument, I don't know that this happened, that one bishop gets up and says, you know, we need to minister to people who have same-sex attraction. You know, good, that's fine. We minister to everybody. But what was represented in these 3 paragraphs was something entirely different, and it could be very disproportionate, you know, to what actually went on in the synod. Now, at that point, you had a turnaround, the official, and Father Lombardi, who's the spokesman for the Vatican, got up in that second day and said, I've been asked by the committee that's running the synod and by the bishops to issue a clarification. And the clarification did not go so far as to say, well, you know, yesterday was wrong. We had this document that wasn't really approved by the bishops. No one, a lot of them had not read it. The Pope had read it, though, and he may have just decided to keep hands off. We don't know about what his thinking was. But the second week was largely taken up with what are called circuli minores, smaller circles that are, you know, they're language circles. So there were 3 English language circles. Cardinal Burke ran one. I think Pell was in another. I forget who else. There were those. There were 2 French language, a couple of Spanish. Anyway, there are 10 of them. And at the end of the process, and this is where they really sit down with that intermediate text and they start making suggestions. The numbers vary, but there were somewhere between 470 and 700 modi, they're called, modifications that were suggested. Now, this is a document that's 3 typewritten pages. So, you know, to have even if it's only 470 modifications in 3 typewritten pages, you're talking about some serious objections to what's going on there. And the French group, I love the French group. I've translated whole books from French, but the French being the French, they said that the document was turgid, rambling, excessively verbose, and therefore rather generally boring. Yeah, the French, boring is the worst thing you can possibly be. My friend Sandro Magister, who is really one of the great Vaticanologists living today, is an Italian, was sitting next to me when this announcement of how many modifications were suggested was made. And he turned to me and he said, Roberto, we just got hit with a ton of Vaseline. I don't know if this is I speak Italian pretty well because I lived in Italy, but I don't know if this is a common phrase. What he meant was, you know, we got this smooth, gooey but not very substantial report on what actually happened in these small circles. And there were so many modifications that were introduced that people were believing that we wouldn't arrive at a final text, that Saturday would come, and these cardinals and archbishops have things to do back in their own dioceses. They've got confirmations and, all sorts of things they need to do. So they thought, actually, they were going to have to leave on that Sunday after Paul VI was beatified without a final document. But by the grace of God and through other interventions, eventually the text was produced. It was late in the evening on Saturday. And one last kind of element that just to have in mind going forward. There are basically 3 paragraphs that were not approved by the 2/3 majority that you have to have by the bishops who are part of the Synod in order to become part of the official final report. And they were exactly the 3 that you would anticipate. One, I could read it, but it's not worth going into it in great detail, and we can talk about it if you have some questions. One had to do with the church's outreach toward people with same-sex attraction. Very much modified. Language far less radical than that one passage I read from the intermediate report. But even that, for various reasons, it could be people wanted to go farther, they thought even that went too far. Even that was rejected and did not receive the necessary 2/3 majority. And then there were 2 other paragraphs, very brief paragraphs, like 3 sentences on divorce and remarriage and communion that, as I said, kicked the can down the road and said this is a complex theological thing, and there's a commission now that the Holy Father has appointed to carry things forward between now and next October. So those 3, the most controversial things, the only things you probably heard about if you followed this only in the secular media, are not part of the official final report, although the Holy Father asked that they be included in all the votes, because they vote paragraph by paragraph as they get near the end, all those be included and the vote tallies be indicated, which was an unusual departure from the standard way of running a synod. One of the interesting things is that the Cardinal Baldisseri tried to suppress those modi. They actually, we got the reports of these small circles about the language. And so there seemed to have been some attempt to manipulate or control, and Cardinal Pell was talking about this toward the end of the Synod. And yet the process seemed to have worked. The process, at the end of the day, the document that came out from the bishops is a Catholic document. It's got a few oddities in it, and there's going to continue to be some static as things go forward, but the process kind of overall worked despite the way that it looked. So I'll leave you with that account of it, and I'm sure you all have some questions, but be aware going forward, because for the next year, we're going to hear a lot about these topics in the secular press as well as in the Catholic press. Be aware that those subjects are going to be probably mispresented or misrepresented as we get closer and closer to October, and when we get actually into next October where these things are going to be debated. I would be very cautious about who you pay attention to in the media. You can read the Catholic thing. We'll have a daily report written by someone I trust reasonably well. But there will be others. I think Sandro Magister is very good. Some of the other American reporters are pretty good. Frank Rocca, who's an American and runs the Catholic News Service desk, he himself is very good. Some of the staff are a little bit less reliable, I think, than he is. But this is a story that's not done. It's still a work in progress. And we have to anticipate, because the whole question of family and marriage is so controverted in our society, as we know, right? I mean, it touches all of us, and then even divorce and same-sex attraction probably touches almost all of our families as well, and therefore, it's going to reach into everybody's lives, and there's going to be a lot of controversy. I gave a talk on the same subject in New York the other day, and a guy, very good old Italian paisan, said to me, I'm with you all the way, but excluding people from communion because they're divorced and remarried, I can't, I don't like that the church does that. But I think we have to say with Cardinal Pell at the end of the day that even if you wish that Jesus was a little softer on divorce, he wasn't. And we have to stick with him. Thank you.
did it work because there was this other voice speaking out about what was going on at the Synod?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the case that people who publicized a different understanding of what was going on helped. But, you know, Napier, Cardinal Burke, Cardinal Pell, Cardinal Mueller from Germany, all these guys were very outspoken, and although the proceedings themselves were off the record, they were not shy about coming out and making clear that, as Napier said, a wrong message went out. So it was extremely helpful, and of course that's one of the things that in the media age can both help and hinder. That you know, there are no secrets anymore. Somebody gets shot somewhere, and it's usually somebody's got a cell phone and has been taking pictures of it. It's very hard to keep secrets given the way that the media environment is. And I also think we'll know what happened inside the Synod eventually, because even when I covered the conclave, there are these things that are called the general congregations, where they speak, the cardinals kind of talk among themselves informally, but it's all off the record. Even when that was going on, there were daily reports in the Italian press the next day. Yeah, I mean, this is all they're supposed to be sworn to secrecy, but they all leak because they got an enemy, and he leaks to his guy, and I leak to my guy. And one American cardinal said to me that he was standing next to a Brazilian cardinal during one of these general congregations, and the guy spoke off the cuff. He had no text. And the next morning, the entire speech was published in one of the Italian newspapers. Somehow, you know, somehow they had gotten a microphone in there, recorded it, transcribed it, and it came out. So, you know, it's even hard. I was worried that the conclave was actually going to be, you know, bugged somehow. That's been a worry in the Vatican for a couple of conclaves now.
I'm looking forward to next year. The horrible thing is that it's obvious, at least to some degree, the extraordinary synod wasn't the staff acting a certain way. By the very fact of having someone like Forte or running the thing, that's a conscious decision to manipulate things in a certain way. Mm-hmm. During the next year, how much do you think those people, perhaps including Pope Francis, will try to stack the deck, take all the face cards out of it, so that the ordinary synod will come to a preordained type of conclusion that may be not what we would thought for the history and tradition of the Catholic Church. I was very encouraged by two things this week. One was that Forte got voted down in Italy as being vice president of the Italian Bishops' Conference. God bless our paisans. Okay. Number two, okay, the fact that the American delegates who were sent to the Synod are good guys.
Yeah, they are.
So how much do you think that it seems to be a swell of the consensus fidelium, the faithful, rather than the consensus of infidelium, those who don't believe, that are swelling to support the traditional teaching of the Church? Do you think, one, do you think that's going to continue to occur during the next year? Number two, do you think the pressures that want to stop that, to change de facto, perhaps not de jure, but de facto teaching of the Church, will be aggressive to stop the swelling, to manipulate the Synod as they did, as they tried to do the extraordinary Synod?
Yeah, I don't know if I would exactly characterize it the way you did, because there have been charges of manipulation. It's clear to me that Archbishop Forte, who I know personally, by the way, I mean, one of my advisory board members was an Italian ambassador to the United States who's now retired, and I had dinner one time at his home in Washington with Archbishop Forte, who's very intelligent, by the way, and he isn't like an ideologue solely on these subjects. But look, we'll see, depending on how Francis appoints people, and there's a whole question of, you know, who are his friends, and Cardinal George said in that amazing interview the other day that he needs to hear, you know, who's advising him. He needs to hear some other voices, not just Maradiaga and Marx and maybe Bruno Forte and others. And by the way, Forte was defeated 2-1. I mean, this wasn't like a close race for vice president of the Italian Bishops' Conference. The Italian bishops apparently were pretty solid, you know, on this sort of thing. I just want to say, just one second. I think a key point to pay attention to is this question of pastoral practice and doctrine. Because even Cardinal Casper, keeps saying, oh, we can't change the doctrine because that's the Lord said marriage is indissoluble. But what they want to do is, the practice itself is so radically discordant with the actual doctrine that they might as well change the doctrine. You know, I mean, if it's true, as I said, that if you take that Greek approach, that Orthodox approach, that marriage wasn't dissolved, but we're allowing somebody who's in a sexual relationship with somebody to receive communion, somebody they're not married to. I mean, this is the law of non-contradiction. You know, unless God is going to repeal laws of logic, and I don't think he's about to do that, you know, how are you going to move forward? So I would just pay attention to what is said about change of pastoral practice, because it's actually hard not to really, in effect, the way you're saying, in effect, change the doctrine if you change the practice. We'll know by who gets appointed. If Forte gets appointed again from the outside as a kind of one of the committee members who actually runs things, I think that will be a sign, but we'll see. Yeah, go ahead.
Archbishop Zulich and Pope both talked about the importance of the integrity of the process of the Synod. And, you know, I'm not sure how I feel about it, even having listened to you talk, I'm not quite sure about some of the mysterious things about this. You know, come out almost with more words, less clarity.
Mm-hmm.
Cardinal Casper, I don't think respected the process. He was very political. He had a video out beforehand advocating this type of situation, which is kind of, you know, so sentimental. It's really kind of a no-fault divorce kind of perspective. He gets to the Synod. He says the great majority is me. I've spoken to the Pope. I know his thoughts. If I'm not speaking for the Pope, I know his thoughts. Completely agrees with me. He said that you don't have to pay attention to the African bishops or the bishops from Muslim countries. We know, you know, and it's quite a hurtful and harmful thing. Of course, he's completely fluent in English, and then people claim he was misunderstood or was translated. And then he never apologized for any of this. He basically tried to co-opt the process, and it was a great opportunity for the Pope to tilt to the center, stand for the process, and either say, no one speaks for me, or he goes to a sidebar with Cardinal Casper and says, you know, really need to step up and correct the record here. That didn't happen. And then afterwards, you know, the papers report about Burke being demoted and Casper's given an honor in
Catholic
University.
Right.
So those are some pretty powerful optics, and I don't need to, you know, be conspiratorial. I think that all those things happen. Of course, there's a counter perspective, but there are opportunities to rescue these optics that are presented to the Pope, and he's not taking. And I guess if I had an audience with him, of course I won't, I would say, take one of these opportunities, get in the middle, triangulate, and if you really believe in the process, and people are speaking outside of doctrine, which Casper is, don't let him say, I'm running the show. And I think that these are really critical moments. So anyway, that's my perspective.
Yeah, I think everything you just said is exactly right. I'd even add one other point. The Italians who follow the Vatican told me that they felt, and there's no way to prove this, but let's just put it out on the table. They felt that the process, the manipulation of the parliamentary process was something that they're very familiar with from Italian secular politics. That what the left in Italy will do is it'll put out an extremely left-wing progressive point in the parliament. And then when the outrage comes, they'll back off, but they've established the beachhead, you know, and then now they look moderate. Well, okay, you know, pull back to here. And the trouble is that now, at the very highest levels of the church, no matter what gets voted on, we have a conversation, right? I mean, before we had a teaching. Now we have a conversation, you know. Cardinals publicly disagree about divorced, remarried Catholics receiving communion. Cardinals publicly disagree about reaching out to people in same-sex relationships. And I've got to say, I mean, I thought that Cardinal Schönborn from Vienna, who used to be a friend, I mean, I guess I still regard him as a friend, but I thought what he did was utterly disgraceful. he went on and on in one of the press briefings about how a couple that he knew, a gay couple, two guys, one got ill and the other one took care of him, and we have to recognize this. Well, of course. I mean, look, that's just human charity. People taking care of one another. It could be a husband and a wife. It could be a child and a parent. It could be two friends, two neighbors. But that has nothing to do with sex. I mean, there seemed to me to be a desire to kind of paper over the underlying problem by saying, well, look, these people are taking care of one another. Well, that's great. I mean, who could be against that? And valuing that, that's fine. So there seems now, some of my kids only one of my kids doesn't follow these things well. The other two are kind of intensely interested in it. But my youngest daughter now has this sense that, well, the Pope is discussing these things. And even my friends who are not Catholic, Dad, are telling me, gee, this Pope is, he's kind of moving our way. And that's the biggest problem of all. And you're right to say he doesn't, people have asked for clarifications, and he doesn't seem to want to do it.
But he had a real opportunity.
Yeah, he did.
To at least respect the process. And I think that, when he spoke to that woman in Argentina, and that got out, he had said, well, just go to the next priest. After a while, these things become accretive. And people said, well, maybe the doctrine's just words on the page. People talk about the doctrine, maybe what's in the practice. The reverse can also be true.
Right.
If the practice is changed in churches, the doctrine either becomes irrelevant or eventually the doctrine changes. But I think it's important that the process be much less political, much more fair. And I think that there's going to be plenty of opportunities in the future for the Pope to right that. If he wants to, and he continues not to, he begins to suggest that this really is the valid direction that he wants to take things. So I think in the future there's going to be plenty of opportunities. Like, wait a second. I hope he does and allows the process to unfold.
That I know of, there was only one point at which the Pope spoke during the actual Synod. And it came at the very end when those reports from the language groups had been submitted. And I have them. I don't think I have them in this file. I have them at home. And Cardinal Burke said, well, we're not going to publish those. And the room erupted, and they said, no, absolutely. We need to have these written reports that the 10 language groups put together so we can have this stuff on the record. They didn't even vote on it. It was by acclamation. And Baldessari looked over at the Pope, and the Pope kind of gave him the high sign and said, okay, you can do it. That's the only indication we have that the Holy Father intervened at any point during the actual process. But the process itself seems to have been set up in a way that it invited problems. And
the people who are the most aggressive and the most political really set the tone. We'll see what happens next.
Right.
That's something different, I think, from the Pope. Archbishop Zubich is, advocating for, which is much more balanced in the discussion.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Yeah. Go ahead.
Wondering what was the full story or any insight you can bring about Cardinal Burke's promotion you heard when you were over there? We all heard it was coming,
Yeah. I think it is a demotion. The fact that he was dropped from the bishops, the Congregation for Bishops earlier in the year, indicated one thing. I don't think I'm betraying any trust. I saw Cardinal Burke back in the spring, and he said it was a very weird time to be in Rome. That people were talking about reform of the Vatican legal process. He was the head of the Signatura, which is like being the Chief Justice of the American Supreme Court. And he said, I keep hearing that there's going to be reform of the canon law process, but no one's talking to me. Can you imagine the guy who's the chief sort of legal eagle in the church is not even being spoken? You can take his advice or not take his advice, but he's not even being spoken to about what's going on. And you know how he is. He's not directly critical of anybody. He can make comments, but he just said, it's a very weird time to be in Rome. I don't know what's going on. So whether the Pope himself decided he didn't want Cardinal Burke in that very sensitive position, which involves marriage and family issues, or whether advisors told him to move on to somebody else, we don't know. But ultimately, the Pope is the guy who has to make the decision. And at the very least, it seems he's listening to people who didn't like a figure like Burke being there. And we'll see about others. I mean, there's Cardinal Mueller at Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Cardinal Pell is involved in the economic reform of the papacy. But if these guys are not in the next synod, that would tell us something. You know.
On behalf of the Chicago Leadership Forum and Relevant Radio, we'd like to give a great round of applause for the insights that Dr. Robert Royal has just shared with us and thank him. And I hope that he can maybe answer a few more questions off to the side if you'd like to chat with him. Thank you very much, Dr. Royal.